Hello, Andrew Hebard here with the Flat channel, Regenerative Omegas for a Regenerative Planet. And today's guest is Marissa Bronfman, who's the founder and executive director of Future Ocean Foods. Marissa, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Marissa, I'm going to try and do justice to your very impressive bio. And I'm sure there's things that I'll miss or get wrong. But I believe this finds you in Nova Scotia today, where you're living, you're based, and you describe yourself as a serial entrepreneur, and with your sort of many skill sets, including being a public speaker, a writer, a coach, a mentor, and if I understand rightly, that your sort of center of gravity is around business and advising businesses and helping businesses grow, but not any businesses, businesses that have kind of like a social impact or an environmental impact. And within that, you advise companies on impact investing as well. And although you're based in Nova Scotia, I think your career and your work covers two very different countries, both Canada and India.
That's right, very different.
And is that a fair summary? Have I missed anything there that you'd like to share with our readers,
Thank you,
listeners?
Andrew. No, that's wonderful. And it's been a really interesting journey thus far. Never expected to find myself in Nova Scotia, but it is the perfect place from which to do this ocean-based work that we're going to talk about.
That's great. That's great. So what took you to Nova Scotia?
So as you said, I work with food tech founders and impact investors. And I was living in Toronto, where I'm from. I had come back from India a few years earlier, and a food tech founder reached out to me to work on a fermentation project. The space of fermentation for me is really exciting. And he happened to be based in Halifax. And although I've been to the west coast of Canada many times, I am embarrassed to admit I had not yet been to the Maritimes. So it was totally new for me. I flew out here for a work meeting. It was like a 23-hour trip, and then came back for 5 days. And as I started doing this fermentation work, and especially on my second trip, I started learning about the innovation ecosystem out here in the Maritimes, which I know you're familiar with, and was really blown away. I think there is incredible capacity, knowledge, and expertise here that most folks don't know about, myself included, until recently. And also, you know, Future Ocean Foods is centered on alternative seafood. This place here historically is deeply tied to traditional seafood. So a really interesting place to talk about the future of food.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, we're kind of familiar with the region there. We have a facility and a business on Prince Edward Island, just
Right.
across the water there from Nova Scotia. And I agree that the resources there and the vibrancy of the natural products industry in the Maritimes is phenomenal. And you know, with that comes expertise, comes networking, and we've found tremendous help there from organizations like NPC, Natural Products Canada, and the PEI Bio Alliance. That's just to name a couple. So I can completely understand why being based having Future Oceans Foods based there makes a lot of sense. So you touched briefly on Future Ocean Foods is about alternative seafood and looking at ways of I guess culturing alternative seafood. Could you share a little bit about what was your real motivation and inspiration for doing this? Because you are the founder, you're the brainchild behind this. So what was your motivator for doing this?
Thanks, Andrew. I had been asked to co-host an event a couple of years ago called The Future of Seafood is Vegan. I'm vegan myself. I'm plant-based. I have been for many years. And up until that point, didn't have a specific area of focus within food tech or food and impact investing, although I do have a background in plant-based consumer packaged goods. So I was asked by a friend of mine who has an alternative seafood company in Canada to co-host this event with her and an impact investor from New York. And it was for other impact investors in Toronto. So of course I said yes. And by the end of this hour event for investors, my fellow panelists had convinced me that alternative seafood was the space to look at. I was so excited by the challenges, the solutions, the opportunities. And I don't really think that I understood just how big of a problem we have in and around our oceans and the sentient beings within them until I did that event. Because of my work in food tech, I knew that the Precision Fermentation Alliance had formed. There were other alliances and coalitions forming to support the future of food and food technology. But for some reason, there was nothing for alternative seafood. And I thought, we need to work together to make sure that there's success in this space. And so I started talking to folks that I knew, Chris Bryson from New School Foods in Toronto, or Ofik from Oshi, formerly known as Plantish from Israel, and just said, if there was an international group, would that be interesting to you? Would that be useful and helpful? And they said yes, and others I spoke to said yes. And I started talking to more and more people in and around alternative seafood, and everyone was very enthusiastic. And so after many conversations in many different time zones, I formed Future Ocean Foods, and we launched a year ago with 36 members across plant-based fermentation and cultivated seafood and technology. And next month, we will be announcing lots more new members as well.
It's a tremendous success, and kind of begs the question, Marissa, is this your first kind of experience with organizing and assembling what would be effectively a global trade association?
It definitely is. I've put together other sort of social impact initiatives, both in India and Canada before, but nothing as large in scope as this one. And of course, your amazing company is one of our members, and excited to talk about the collaboration you have with another member in a few minutes. I really didn't set out to do anything except bring folks together. And the more and more I started having conversations, the more and more founders and the more and more countries. So as of next month, we will have members in over 17 countries around the world, which is really pretty cool.
We have team members across 6 different time zones, and that's challenging for organizing meetings. So I can only imagine 17 different countries globally. Gosh, that takes some logistics and planning. So as you mentioned, so your members are unified by their mission to create alternative seafoods, and I guess from that they're using different feedstocks for different raw materials, including terrestrial grown plants, I guess fermentation products and cell cultured products also a part of the overall mix there. What sort of challenges does that present them in terms of you're trying to mimic something that nature has created, both in terms of its nutritional character or nutritional composition and its physical characteristics, its sort of mouthfeel and what have you. So is that a key area of innovation for your members, and what Future Ocean Foods is helping them with?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, one of our goals is to help companies reach nutritional equivalency or superiority with their products. So like we've seen with terrestrial meat, consumers want to know that if they're changing what they're buying, that they're not sacrificing nutrition. And typically what that comes down to is protein. What's unique about alternative seafood is that in addition to protein, there is this question about omegas. And a lot of people still think that seafood, specifically fish, is the healthier choice, often because of those omegas. So even with growing awareness with things like microplastics and antibiotics and mercury, et cetera, there is still this thing we call the health halo around seafood. And so there is a lot of education and awareness to be done. But going back to omegas, it's definitely tricky, and you have an incredible omega product. So that it can be very difficult to create something that tastes like seafood, looks like seafood, costs similarly to seafood, and has the same or better nutrition. So it's definitely a challenge. There are folks that are doing really well with that. And, historically, meat, seafood, dairy industries have all been supported by government financially in really big ways. And that's allowed producers to, create things at scale to go faster. And so for this industry, alternative seafood, and the folks that are within alternative seafood, it is a challenge because we don't have those subsidies from government. And especially now in this economic climate, we don't have that patient capital coming in from investors either. So we have a lot of work to do on the nutrition front and others. And, for our members and other folks, it's a really challenging time because there's not a lot of capital with which to do that work.
Obviously, as soon as the word omegas comes up, I like my alert on message goes off. But I do want to touch on something that I wasn't expecting us to talk about, but this area fascinates me greatly from both also having a bias towards impact investment and helping primary producers get off first base with things. And it's something that we see, our business is very much involved, as you know, in the specialty crop production area and taking underutilized plant species that have unique therapeutic or health benefits and turning them into sustainable, hopefully regeneratively produced ingredients. But the odds are stacked against you when you look at the commodity infrastructure. And as you talk about, your producers and your members are up against a heavily subsidized, heavily industrialized, heavily scaled industry. Primary producers in the agriculture world face exactly the same challenges with things like soybean and corn. And that's why we have, I think, we have a mutual interest there around biodiversity and increasing the availability of nutrients from a broader pool rather than tapping into it, whether we tap into wild caught fish or whether we tap into soybeans or corn. It's very difficult to break out of that environment. And as you say, accessibility to capital to support you doing that is also challenging, because with that comes a potential perception of it's risky because you're not getting subsidies, you're not getting government intervention and that sort of thing. So it's a fascinating area. But back to the subject of omegas, you're absolutely right around seafood having this halo effect. And I was looking, and as I gave a presentation the other day about how, as an ingredient supplier and an ingredient focused industry, we need to think beyond wild caught fish, because there will come a time we're already at sort of maximum harvesting of fish. And as population grows, even meeting new incremental growth has to come from alternative sources. It's not going to come from the original sources. But when you look at the numbers of, and you use the term sentient beings, which I love, the amount of life that we're taking out of the oceans, the latest numbers that I saw is about 100 to 120 million metric tons a year of wild caught fish and life, which is such a mind-bogglingly enormous number. And that's just the reported numbers. Of course, we know that it's beyond that. How do your members address this challenge then of scalability to go from what is in many instances, starts in a laboratory at very sort of almost lab scale, moving to pilot scale, proof of principle scale, to that next step to scaling up and saying, actually, I can produce thousands or millions of tons of these products to be a reliable and consistent supply to compete with, say, my hometown, my home heritage of Scottish salmon and that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And also, to the point of what's happening in our oceans right now, I can admit that, years ago, I ate seafood, but I was very much against eating meat and wearing leather. And for me, there was such a big distinction. And of course, don't feel that way today. I think part of the problem is we cannot see really what's happening underwater, we as a global population, but we can see what's happening on land. So there is much more awareness now about the treatment of farm animals, for example. And then when you think of the life of a cow compared to a little fish, it's really easy to say, well, the fish is healthy and it's not a mammal and it's just this small, tiny being, so I can justify seafood. But as you just mentioned, and a lot of people don't know this, it's not just that one fish. Industrial fishing and the seafood industry is taking so many beings out of the ocean. Over and above fish, we're talking about whales and turtles and dolphins and, also species that rely on those species. So we're seeing, coastal communities where bears are starving and the orcas are starving. I mean, it's such a massive problem and we can't see it. And so that's an awareness and education piece that certainly needs to change. What people do see, though, is what's available to them in the grocery store. And so, back to your question of how can producers, especially without a lot of those subsidies, reach a scale where they can compete, offer price parity with the wild caught or the farmed salmon, for example, that they're used to finding, it's really challenging. It's really challenging without the input of that patient capital to allow them the time and energy to scale. The CapEx in fermentation and cultivated technology is enormous, as you know, and I'm sure lots of your listeners know, but the output down the road could also be enormous. And so that's what we're betting on in those industries. There are some companies and some members that have reached price parity with their products, which is like the most incredible, extraordinary achievement, given all the barriers we just talked about. And they are working so hard to do that. Some are co-fermenting algae and mycelium, for example. So we're going back to the ocean, but we're looking at a regenerative food source, microalgae. We're going back to the earth. We're looking at fungi. So folks are definitely getting creative. They're blending, science with creativity. And then there's a storytelling piece that we have to wrap it all into for consumers, for investors, for governments. Lots of work to be done.
That innovation is essential, but it's also, I mean, it's kind of awesome as the building blocks for, where larger industries can come in and then take some of the heavy lifting off their shoulders. I think that point that you made about price parity is getting to that proof of principle to say, yes, actually we can do this, but now we need someone else to sort of carry the load and help us scale. So that's great that they're achieving that. We touched on omegas, and of course we're talking about omega-3s with seafood and the healthy halo effect. And it's not just the halo effect. It is it's a proven sort of well-documented benefit of consuming seafood is the high levels of omega-3 and the health outcomes that you expect from that. Of course, as we talked about, the supply now is finite and it's becoming increasingly fragile, and I think it's becoming increasingly vulnerable, and it's vulnerable to a whole bunch of different things, not to mention climate change, and some of the other things you mentioned, microplastics and pollutants and that sort of thing. So the writing is on the wall that we've got to find alternative sources for that. And I'm really curious and fascinated in the idea of how do you mimic and get a nutritional equivalence with seafood. So, the omega-3 content is a key area, protein is a key area. And I would think that is the equivalency is probably easier than the characteristics around sensory and stuff like that. So, and it's funny, I'm a very keen fisherman, but I'm 98% in the catch and release category, and a little bit I will keep now and again, but I'm not a buyer of seafood. I try to be self-sufficient and sort of forage my own stuff when I'm out fishing. And of course, anybody that enjoys seafood and particularly fishing knows that fresh fish does not taste of fish. It absolutely shouldn't taste of fish. That's the whole point behind it. When people say it has that characteristic fishy taste, it's that the fish has started to exceed its sell-by date. So with our partnership with some of your members, and we're delighted that they're looking at ahi flour as an ingredient to provide the omega-3 nutritional equivalency to fish oil. But it doesn't have the taste of fish. It has much more of a mild, fresh taste than it would of fish. So I'm hoping that actually has a benefit to your members, that it has the sort of characteristic fresh ocean taste, but not the taste of fish. Is that something that you hear or can comment on?
Yeah, that's great. And it's really cool to see slowly that there are folks understanding that omegas can come from different places. It need not come from fish. And also on the sensory side, we can create umami flavors. We can create that ocean experience without it being a fishy experience. And ahi flour definitely plays a part in that, as do some other companies and ingredients. So there are also two schools of thought on the seafood analogs. One is that we have to create something that absolutely mimics the original. And you had brought that up a few minutes ago. And there are lots of consumers that if they're going to make a change, they want the exact analog. But there is also a group of folks that don't need it to be exactly the same, that perhaps don't want a fishy taste, perhaps don't need a flakiness or some kind of texture. And even in Asia, we're seeing that there are populations that are really interested in the beauty benefits or the health benefits or the brain benefits of a food versus it being the exact analog of what they're used to. So lots of interesting markets, lots of developments, and lots of opportunity as well. This is a really cool opportunity for producers to use something like ahi flour, offer consumers an incredible nutritional profile, a slightly different taste, which I think you're saying could be improved upon, and I'm sure others would agree, from the original. And yeah, lots of cool things happening.
So that's a really interesting way of looking at it, that you're positioning this not just as a seafood alternative or a seafood analog, but as a healthy category of foods. And I think that's probably why you have the name future ocean foods rather than sort of alternative seafoods or something like that, because the future ocean foods is a much broader kind of mindset, I guess, than trying to say we are an alternative to this particular, fillet of salmon or what have you.
Yeah, exactly. And, our members, like yourself, are not just creating analogs. We have a lot of ingredient producers that are producing for alternative seafood, but also a host of other industries, including, nutraceuticals and other spaces. But the idea is when we look at the future of food, we've got to get creative. And so to me, a future ocean food is also that microalgae. It's also that seaweed. It's not necessarily, just creating that final product analog.
That's a really good point. I was reading a book just recently, and I can't remember the author, but it was about vertical farming, vertical sea aquaculture, I guess, using seafood, mollusks, that sort of thing, in a sort of like a suspended environment. You probably know the book I'm talking about. I think it's called Eat Like a Fish.
I'm not sure, but that sounds like a great title.
I think it's called Eat Like a Fish, and it's using, the principle of sunlight and microalgae as for the food source for bivalves and mollusks and seaweed and that sort of thing. But the opportunity that the oceans provide us for sustainable and regenerative nutrition is huge compared to what I would call depletive nutrition or extractive nutrition, where we're taking out more than we're putting back in. So Marissa, wildest dreams 5 years from now for future ocean foods, what does that look like for you and your members?
Oh gosh. Well, as a passionate vegan, and many of our other members are very passionate about, saving our oceans and all the beings in and around them. Wildest dream would be to do just that. Like you said, the problem is massive. We are on track to have no fish left in the sea by 2048. We have pods of orcas chasing down, salmon fishing boats because they're starving to death. The amount of carbon that's being released in the oceans due to trawling, affects our entire planet. Like really, we don't have enough time on this podcast to talk about all the problems related to the seafood industry with our oceans. So to me, wildest dreams is that we could come up with alternatives, and those could, range from using ahi flour to microalgae to mycelium to cell-based technology, fermentation, and even some of your original plant-based options that still have, great taste, texture, nutrition, and price, and really make a huge positive impact. We have to stop what we're doing. There simply aren't enough fish left in the sea. Aquaculture, which we haven't talked about, has its own host of very bad problems. And so we really have to support and accelerate the growth of alternative seafood, both on the ingredient side and the final product side, and certainly the technology side. And that's going to take a lot of capital. It's going to take a lot of work on education and awareness. It's going to take a lot of patient capital from governments, from venture, from angels. And I do believe, we've got, as of September, almost 50 folks in over 17 countries around the world. I think we have the best of the best working on solving these problems, yourself included, Andrew. And I believe deeply that if we work together and collaborate, and tell the world what's possible, that we'll be able to do it.
Thank you. Well, I wish you every success in your mission. One thing that also comes to mind when listening to you say that is that there's a really interesting parallel, I think, between what we're trying to achieve with Nature's Crops and ahi flour and the Future Ocean Foods, in that our mission, my personal calling in this area, is to improve global omega nutrition for everybody, make it accessible, like open source omega-3 nutrition to improve health outcomes for as many people as possible. And in doing so, improve the health outcomes of the planet. So, it was driven by an opportunity and a need to say that the omega-3 industry that relies purely on supplementation at the moment is clearly failing because so many people are still deficient in omega-3s. So the current model is not meeting the demands or the opportunity of industry and health and wellness. We need a new model, and that's where we came in and looked at it and said, well, there's an opportunity here to do this with plant-based, sustainable, regenerative practices. But there's a knock-on to that, and this is what I really like about the whole business model that we've been able to create, and it sounds like Future Ocean Foods has been able to create, is that you set out to have this mission to achieve this, but you actually have I was going to say unintended consequence, but it's actually very much an intended consequence of enriching the oceans or the biosphere at the same time of doing it. And that is, I think, a very powerful model for businesses to have. It's why we went down the route of being a B Corp, where it allows you to put purpose ahead of profit. And it sounds like that's very much the mission of Future Ocean Foods, in that you're supporting your members to create a product, and that product has health and wellness benefits. But in doing so, it's playing a huge role in conservation and environmental sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many benefits to supporting and accelerating the alternative seafood space. Of course, I told you about my personal dream of, saving our oceans and all the beings in and around them. But as you also mentioned, we're on track to have 10 billion people on this planet by 2050 that all have their individual needs. They've got needs for protein, they've got needs for omegas and other nutritional factors that we simply will not be able to provide with the food systems we have in place now. And so, just like you've looked to ahi flour, we need to look to other ways and other sources to feed people. So, whether you're coming at alternative seafood because you care about the oceans, perhaps you're passionate about the whales, or you're passionate about feeding, the next 10 billion people, or conserving the environment, wherever you come from, and maybe it's all of the above. There are a lot of solutions that our members are working on, and they're all very important.
Yeah, well, I wish you and your members every success, Marissa, in achieving your mission. If people want to learn more about yourself and Future Ocean Foods, we'll post a link here at the bottom of the video, so that would be accessible to people, and they can follow you on various social media platforms. So thank you very much for joining us today. Any closing comments before we sign off?
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Thanks for all you're doing to save our oceans with ahi flour, and just give a shout out to your recent partnership with one of our other members, Infused Nutrition. I know there was lots of splashy headlines about that. That's another thing that's so cool about Future Ocean Foods. We really have lots of members coming together, like yourself and Infused and many others, to come up with different ways to build the future of food. So yes, if somebody wants to reach out or learn more, our website is futureoceanfoods.org. And I'm always happy to hear from folks that want to do something with us, our members, to save our oceans.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and every success for the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you for having me.